Okay. I finally finished editing my montage and script. Then I realised the footage is actually quite old. I've made a lot of changes since then, so I decided to do the Trial of Chaos and the Trial Master one more time. And this is how the bosses look now. It's taken a week of testing, and to be honest, compared to the last video, that's not that much time. So for those of you who saw my previous videos covering this build, and are waiting for the endgame update, this is sort of it, but it's also sort of the ramblings of an absolute madman. I've tried so many different things, and I made the huge mistake of trying them all at the same time. Some things improve the build, and some things clearly have incredible potential, but they just need more time and currency setting aside to give it a proper and fair test. So firstly, huge shout outs to the Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery commenters. All of you have been extremely helpful in learning how it works, and I do think with the correct investment, it could be a really solid alternative to what I'll be showing today, and quite possibly an even stronger version of the build than the physical one, which is what I decided to build upon. There will be other update guides in the future, as there's still loads to test, but more importantly, the build is now clearing breaches pretty damn well. It's just me that's not very good at them. So when I've got the hang of it properly, I'll probably make a video quickly talking about that, as the amount of loot we get from breaches has far outweighed that of any other map mechanic. Let's start with the gear changes. Thanks to a commenter, I tried out these unique boots called the Boots of Earl. These can be bought extremely cheaply, but I decided to buy a completely maxed out one for 10 exalts, and because I didn't think it was that expensive, I decided to try and corrupt it. Thankfully, or not I suppose, nothing happened. I'll still be making this guide aimed at basically everybody, so occasionally I will stop and break down what a couple of things mean, just so newer players, if they might not know, can follow along. Val orbs are used to corrupt items. It's always the last thing you do, because once something is corrupted, it cannot be modified in any other way. This can do great things to an item. In our case, we're hoping it increases the rolls of the item past its initial cap, though it can also completely destroy an item. Anyway, these boots reduce the reservation cost of our undead minions by 20%, so now each of our skeletal snipers are costing 17 spirit each, letting us get out a total of 30 minions. The downside of these boots is they lack any resistance rolls, a very small amount of max life and energy shield, no rarity of items, and no movement speed, which can feel a little bit rough for mapping. How stupid is that? Oh yeah, but there's no movement speed on the boots. No. You could bring a second pair of boots with rarity of items and movement speed for mapping, and swap to the Boots of Earl for bossing. But I didn't want to waste 4 slots in my inventory for a spare pair of boots, so I'm quite happy to walk a little bit slower. One change I wasn't planning on making, but I'm glad I did, was to drop the Oak Sworn shield in place of a Trench Timber Spiked Club, providing another 3 levels to all minion skills. Huge shoutouts to this commenter for sending me a link to talk about all this, as well as showing off a load of other cool tricks in this guy's video, so a link to that video will be in the description. You can spend even more and buy a corrupted one that can roll an even higher level of minion skills. Likewise, we can do that in our necklace to go from +4 levels of fire skills to +5 or even +6. But the cost to do this is extremely expensive. By losing Oaksworn, we do reduce our spirit by 50, lose some chaos resistance, and lose whatever resistances or life we slotted into the gem slot for Oaksworn, as shields count as armor, whereas the Trench Timber is a martial weapon, meaning the slotted runes provide different bonuses. Otherwise, not much has changed. I'd still recommend an Expert Shaman's Mantle for the most spirit possible. Our helmet hasn't changed much either, but I am using a different one now, but that's because I'm trying to stack as much rarity of items found as possible. Gloves are basically the same, but again, I've got a new pair for more added rarity of items found. As with all our gear, we are trying to hit resistance cap while giving ourselves as much life as possible and added rarity of items found. Our amulet is still the same, but I did buy a new one to allocate a different skill, which we'll cover later on in the video. Our rings and belt is something we'll talk about later as well, as I do want to discuss the changes we want to make. Our skills have actually changed quite a bit, and the good news is we actually have something to do. My biggest complaint about how strong our minions had gotten was that it felt like we had nothing to do anymore, except run around and pick up loot. If you didn't follow the end of the previous build, I'll quickly recap it now. Because our minion skill level has gotten so high, Gas Arrow is too expensive to cast, so we dropped Gas Arrow entirely, removing support gems that affect this like Bidding, in place of higher physical damage supports like Brutality. Brutality has interesting drawbacks though. Our minions can no longer deal elemental or chaos damage, so Gas Arrow is completely useless. But in return, we gain incredible physical damage, dealing crazy DPS with this current setup. Alongside this, we drop Flame Orb and Flammability for vulnerability, but more on that later on. Since our minions deal so much damage, we were left running around the map collecting loot as we had nothing else to do. This is where we start making drastic changes. For starters, we can start using 2 different skills to boost our minions' damage, though one of them might not actually work. I'm actually having a really hard time testing things in Path of Exile. I come from MMOs where there's usually training dummies we can pass against, meaning we basically practice our rotation and at the end of it we're giving a DPS number for easy clarification on what works and what doesn't. But the first skill that absolutely does work is a spell called Eye of Winter that provides critical weakness on the enemies, making our minions crit more often. The supports we're running is Acceleration, which gives the skill more projectile speed, Unleash, which actually allows us to fire 2 of these off at the same time, and lastly Mobility. This is just a quality of life change. As it's a long cast time, it can feel quite rough as casting it does slow your character down, so Mobility just makes that feel less rough. But let's very quickly talk about critical weakness. Using Eye of Winter, we can stack this all the way up to 20. Per stack, hits against the target have 0.5% increased critical hit chance. The only thing I'm not sure about is if this critical weakness is additive or multiplicative. Hi, Don from the future here. Critical weakness is additive. We are just straight up adding 10% increased crit chance to our minions. Now, the part that may or may not work is the Flame Wall. The strange thing is I have leveled a character co-op where we used Flame Wall and Spark to clear the game. Why it never dawned on me to have my minions shoot through the Flame Wall, I don't know. Essentially, shooting projectiles through this Flame Wall provides added fire damage, and that fire damage is based on the level of Flame Wall, so we want this as high as we can, which is another benefit of our necklace apparently. I mean, obviously, I had this all planned out from the start. However, our minions are using Brutality, so they can't deal elemental damage, which is why I'm not sure if this works or not. Though as I said, Flame Wall dictates the added fire damage, so I'm fairly confident this does work. On Flame Wall we run Fortress, and if a certain viewer is watching, I now know why everybody uses Fortress. Essentially, a viewer and I were talking on Discord and he asked me why does everybody run Fortress on Flame Wall? And I said I don't know, I can't see any added benefits. Well, by running Fortress, Spell Cascade and Magnified Effect, we are able to place a giant wall in front of our literal army. Without Fortress, for some reason it wasn't very consistent with its placement. Since we are running physical damage only, we want to break the armor of our targets, especially bosses. And I've tried a few different methods of doing this. The first was to take the idea provided by another viewer and run a second sniper gem. Allocate a single minion not running Brutality, that way we can use the poison support gems to cause armor breaking. This worked insanely fast and it instantly broke the armor of our target. But the issue is we can no longer ignite this target or it detonates the gas cloud. So we had to run a support gem on our Infernal Hound to stop this. That's not a problem though. The Hound is essentially just a meat shield for us, so giving up a single gem slot for it, that's totally fine. But where it is a problem is using the new tech I've found, using a Storm Mage to leave a shock debuff on our target. Shock is an ailment that causes the target to take 20% increased damage. I wish I could write more in this paragraph and go into big explanation and details about that. But that's it, they just take more damage. So we're running Stormfire, which means that shocks from supported skills do not expire on ignited enemies, Coursing Current, which basically allows the shock to spread, Conduction, which gives our minion a 100% more chance to shock, and finally we're using Overcharge, which increases the magnitude of our shock by 75%, but it halves the duration of the shock. But that doesn't matter because we're using Stormfire. So now our shocks do not expire so long as the enemy is ignited, and like I said, our hound is always igniting, so long as we don't need to run a gem to stop him being able to ignite. So after that I decided to start playing around with making the army themselves break their target's armor based on their physical attack using the support gem Splinter. And this was actually hilarious because their physical damage is so high, every single target was getting their armor broken in a single arrow. All I could hear every time I went into a map was every single mob getting armor broken from one arrow. In the end, the madness, it consumed me. And to do this, I actually dropped Scattershot. I know, I said Scattershot drastically improves our clear speed, but so does a lot of damage and a lot of minions. So for the most part, I don't even feel a difference on maps, but I absolutely feel the increased damage on bosses. Right, armor breaking covered. Right? Wrong. It felt absolutely criminal running a support gem to break armor on our main damage gem. So I took it off and added in martial tempo in its place. So this gives us more attack speed. Meaning we've dropped Scattershot, which lowered our attack speed, and put martial tempo in to increase our attack speed. And I gotta say, the difference feels incredible. However, to quickly clarify, do not remove Scattershot until your damage is absolutely high enough and you've got an actual army of minions, or it'll feel worse for mapping. But this gets us onto my current setup, which I'll be completely honest with you, is so-so. It does break the armor of bosses, and it doesn't take that long, but it is not instant. Essentially, I have taken the armor break on physical damage support, Splinter, and I've stuck it on the Hound. I gave him Demolisher to increase the break by 40% and called it a day. I'm not overly happy with the solution, but it does work, and it's not as bad as it sounds, especially thanks to vulnerability. This curse is what we're replacing flammability for. It essentially lowers the target's armor, just like armor breaking. So I'm fairly confident that once the armor is broken, vulnerability does nothing anymore. But that doesn't make it useless. We can use it to initially lower the target's armor, making it easier for our Hound to break armor, at least I think. But more importantly is it will increase the damage of our minions, at least until he gets armor broken. On vulnerability, I'm basically running the same setup as I always was, which is Curse Ground, Heightened Curse, Persistence, and Inspiration. Though very recently I've just had an idea of swapping off Persistence and putting on Pain Offering. On Pain Offering I was running Ablation, Dance Macabre, Expanse, and Font of Rage, but I've decided that Expanse isn't really needed, as our minions are obviously snipers and they don't really move around much, so they are typically in range of the Pain Offering. So instead I put Persistence on Pain Offering. That way it lasts longer, and Font of Rage is a lot easier to build up. I kept noticing that the more and more I was in a fight, I could not keep the rage up. So with this method, it actually has a lot higher uptime. So on vulnerability now, honestly I think you only need Curse Ground, Heightened Curse, and Inspiration. And Pain Offering I am now running Ablation, Dance Macabre, Persistence, and Font of Rage. So as a very quick recap for the Hound, we are running Meat Shield, Elemental Army, Culling Strike, Splinter, and Demolish. And for a quick recap of our Skeletal Snipers, we are running Brutality, Heft, Feeding Frenzy, Martial Tempo, and still running Fork. And then lastly, of course, we are still running Grim Feast, of which I don't have a single support gem slotted. There are a couple of small passive changes. Most notable, we do now path to pick up Deadly Swarm. While the crit is a nice extra, the damage and the surrounding small damage nodes are what we are mostly interested in. This allows us to allocate one of the two southern nodes that gives even more minion damage. My choice was two-pronged attack, as it's the much cheaper option. And this is why I bought a new necklace, because previously we allocated Deadly Swarm, and once you've allocated a skill, it cannot be removed and it cannot be overwritten. One comment suggested trying the Wither node at the top left side of the tree, called the Right Hand of Darkness, and so I did. While it actually felt like we were doing more damage, the tooltip of both Brutality and our minions damage made it seem like the added chaos damage from the other passive, Entropic Incarnation, does not actually apply, which makes sense, as circling back to Brutality, our minions can't deal chaos damage. For that reason I have now unleveled this node in the passive tree, but I did keep the damage nodes that surround it. And finally, since our crit rate of the minions are very low, I decided to refund some of the crit related passives, as I wasn't happy with our current Energy Shield being so low. So I have picked up a few more Energy Shield nodes to push us into at least 3000. All this together has made the build significantly stronger, while feeling much more fun to play, as we have various different abilities to cast 8-hour minions. But what's fantastic is if you want to play a 0-button build, you can. You don't need to cast Eye of Winter, you don't need to cast Flame Wall, but you can. What's even better is I know this isn't the final version of the build. There are plenty more things for us to try that will boost our minions even further. With a heavy investment, we can basically resistance cap ourselves while providing enough spirit for 5 to 6 more minions, with over 100% increased rarity of items found, as well as extra life, all from 3 items. The rings are called Venter's Gamble, and the belt is called the Ingenuity Utility Belt, though you are talking 10s, maybe even 100 divines to actually get good enough rolls on these items, when my whole setup at the moment is probably around 4, 5, maybe 6 divines. Though expensive, there are no drawbacks to doing this. And the reason I'm saying this is because I wanted to give a quick disclaimer surrounding unique items. If you're new to ARPGs, or you've come from other ARPGs, it might seem like the natural progression for gear is common, magic, rare, unique, with the end goal being that you are fully equipped with unique items. While this build is now using even more unique items, the actual purpose of unique items is to tailor your build in a very specific way. Many uniques are very low level items, so if they do have defensive stats on them, like life or energy shield, it will be a very low value. Another downside is they often have negative effects on them, such as the amulet causing damage when we ignite something. For our specific build, it doesn't matter. More often than not, your endgame build will actually benefit more from having very strong rare items over more and more uniques. So eventually I do want to start using divine orbs to re-roll the numerical values of my 2 Venter's Gambles, but eventually the goal is to have 2 strong Venter's Gambles and an Ingenuity Utility Belt that we can roll to have a hopefully at least 80%. And what this belt does is it increases the stats provided by our rings, and this 80% can be improved by corrupting it, but I don't think I've got the nerves to try and do that. On top of the planned item changes, if my theories about Flame Wall and vulnerability are correct, we can actually run flammability to increase the added fire damage from Flame Wall once the target is armor broken, which we will find a more efficient way to do so. Lastly, if we can get the rings and belts, this lets us focus heavily on life and energy shield on the rest of our gear, to the point where we could introduce a weapon swap called the Chiming Staff. This staff can give us a buff called the Sigil of Power that increases the effectiveness of our offerings. The other benefit of having a weapon swap is it means that we can swap Blink to allow us to teleport around the map. This will negate the lack of movement speed the build currently has. The reason we don't want to do that now is because when you weapon swap, it actually removes the overshield from Grim Feast, and at around 3000 energy shield, we are not tanky enough to risk teleporting into any on-ground effects. With that, I think the updated build guide is finished. Sorry it took so long, and sorry it's not all solid concrete changes. I didn't realise how hard it'd be to test if things have actually improved or not. For the most part, I've been doing automaton runs and fighting the trial master at the end, then comparing my times to see what helped and what didn't. Otherwise, I've been running tier 18s to try get a level 20 skill gem and seeing how quickly we can kill the bosses. Most of them go down in about 4 to 5 seconds, so I'm really at a point where I'm super happy with the physical version. For those of you waiting for the next SSF part, it is coming, and slight spoiler, we are at maps. And another slight spoiler, I forgot how little loot you actually get when you first reach maps. It's actually brutal. So, thank you all for watching, thank you for listening, thank you so much for 1800 subscribers, it really does mean a lot. So I'll see you all again very, very soon. Bye bye.